In November 1957, a woman mysteriously vanished from a small, remote town in the United States. When investigators took on the case, it took them only a moment to identify a prime suspect. In the rural surroundings of this town, there lived a man notorious as the vampire, or the Butcher of Plainfield, known for crafting various items from bodies exhumed from local graveyards. This man was Ed Gein, the infamous ghoul. Ed Gein entered American history for his macabre hobby of transforming his victims into household furniture, a grotesque and chilling pastime. You're tuning into the case of Ed Gein, the Butcher of Plainfield, and his grotesque collection of human furniture on Mr. Gim's channel Midnight Mysteries and True Crime Stories. If you find this story intriguing and want to hear more real-life cases from around the world, don't hesitate to leave a like as a show of support for our channel. Also, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay updated with the most classic and chilling crime cases. Ed Gein, whose full name was Edward Theodore Gein, had a childhood deeply influenced by his mother, a connection intricately linked to his transformation into a monstrous figure. Living in a secluded farmhouse provided him the perfect conditions to indulge his morbid hobbies, such as exhuming bodies from local cemeteries to craft furniture. Perhaps his extreme isolation drove him to seek companionship in the most macabre ways. Regardless, his actions were horrifyingly inhumane. Like many other serial killers, Ed Gein's early years were marked by events that might be seen as precursors to his later crimes. His story began on a remote farm, where he spent most of his life, located in the small village of Plainfield, Wisconsin. This background set the stage for one of America's most infamous and disturbing criminal cases. On Saturday, November 16, 1957, the village of Plainfield was quieter than usual, as it was the opening day of the local men's hunting season. Bernice Worden, the owner of a small grocery store, took advantage of the quiet time to tidy up her shop. With all the local men out in the woods hunting, she thought she wouldn't need to open the store as early as usual. However, as she was putting away cans of lentils and cheese, she noticed a man parking his car outside the store. Bernice assumed he might be a hunter needing some supplies. The man walked across the parking lot with a shotgun hidden behind his back and entered the store. Bernice greeted him politely and recognized him as the seemingly harmless, slow-witted man who lived on the nearby farm. Despite his usual harmless demeanor, Bernice happened to be the target of his sinister intentions that day. A robbery unfolded at the Plainfield grocery store. Facing the robber, Bernice asked him what he wanted, mentioning she didn't have much cash on hand, but offering him anything in the store if he was hungry or in need of something. It was around 5 p.m. when her son, Frank, returned from his hunting trip. Frank noticed the grocery store's door was locked, but strangely, there were lights on inside. He also realized his mother's delivery truck was missing. Growing concerned, Frank decided to check the nearby gas station to see if anyone had seen his mother, Bernice. The gas station attendant told him they hadn't seen Bernice, and that the store appeared to have been closed since the morning. No one had seen Bernice in the area all day. Frank's worry escalated. Fortunately, as the deputy sheriff of Plainfield, he could quickly raise the alarm about his mother's disappearance. He contacted 3 other men in the local police force, including Sheriff Arthur Schley, whose office was 25 kilometers away. Arthur, previously a truck driver, had taken the position of sheriff at the age of 32 to seek a more stable and well-paying job. The sheriff's role offered him the comfort of a warm office and the advantage of no longer having to live a nomadic life. After all, what could possibly happen in a small American village like Plainfield? As the local law enforcement team gathered and began their investigation, the community of Plainfield was about to uncover one of the most gruesome and notorious cases in American history. The search team included two more officers, Arnie Fries and Alan Chase. They met in front of Bernice's grocery store and decided to break in. Upon entering and seeing the scene inside, Frank immediately understood that his mother had been abducted. Worse, he noticed blood trails leading to the back door and bullet holes in the walls. An experienced reinforcement team was called in. Upon examining the counter, they discovered a sales receipt for antifreeze signed by Ed Gein. At this point, the police had no idea they were about to uncover one of the worst cases in American history, long before the serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer emerged. Frank described Ed Gein as an eccentric man living on a farm not far from their home. Frank had previously visited Ed to ask if he wanted to join the hunt. Two teams were dispatched to locate Ed Gein. The first team was ordered to search the surrounding area for any signs of Bernice or her truck. The second team, including officers Chase and Marty, was ordered to investigate Gein's farm. Upon arriving, the farm looked more like a dilapidated area than a working farm. Some windows were even boarded up. Chase and Marty knocked on the door, but there was no response. Ed Gein was later apprehended as a suspect, but he didn't reveal anything about Bernice's whereabouts. The police returned to the house at the center of the farm. They found a door leading to a side room on the right. As they pushed it open, a putrid stench hit them. The further they went, the stronger and more nauseating the smell became. The officers braced themselves for what lay ahead, not yet aware of the gruesome discoveries that would mark this case as one of the most horrifying in history. Passing through one of the doors, the two men were paralyzed with horror. They saw Bernice there, naked and hanging from the ceiling. Despite the body being decapitated, they could immediately recognize her by her build and skin. Sheriff Arthur went outside and vomited profusely, almost fainting. Officer Elliott then called for reinforcements to Ed Gein's farm. As they entered, they uncovered horrific truths. Over the course of several years, precisely 10, this deranged man had been digging up graves from the local cemetery to make furniture, household items, clothing, and even had occasional fun with them. Sometimes, in impulsive fits, he would also kill people to obtain fresh meat. You might be wondering how a man who seemed normal could commit such atrocious acts. To understand why, we might need to look back at Ed Gein's troubled childhood. Edward Theodore Gein, known as Ed Gein, was born on August 27, 1906, in the village of Plainfield, Wisconsin. From a young age, Ed's life was unfortunate. His father, George Philip Gein, was an alcoholic and a completely lost soul. He died when Ed was young. George's parents had been swept away in a flood, and he was placed in an orphanage and later adopted by an elderly couple who treated him more like a caretaker for their house. Essentially, he lingered there until adulthood. Ed's mother, Augusta grew up in a very strict and devoutly religious family. Over the years, she became engulfed in fanaticism. George didn't realize that this would only exacerbate their conflicts later. Despite everything, he loved her blindly. So, the couple had Ed Gein in August 1906. He was their second child, with Henry being the eldest. Things were far from smooth in Ed's family. George couldn't bear his wife's unreasonable religious fanaticism. He couldn't stand listening to sermons from morning until night. For Augusta, everything was a sin that needed prayer for purification. Her two sons, Henry and Ed, were not allowed to speak to anyone, make noise, or interact with girls or unmarried couples. They had to pray before meals, and of course the youngest son couldn't escape his mother's grasp. Every day she would read him a passage from the Bible. The only time Ed prayed with his mother was to ask God for the imminent death of their violent, alcoholic father. Under candlelight, they would pray together in front of George's portrait, literally asking their God to take him away as soon as possible. Imagine coming home after a long day of work and finding your wife and children praying for your demise. How would that make you feel? But it seemed their prayers had no effect, because George survived despite Augusta's fanaticism. When Ed was 7, Augusta saved some money from her small business. She owned a meat shop and, with her savings, bought a farm. She wanted to isolate her family from society as much as possible, desperately wanting them to share her religious fervor. But it seemed she failed in Plainfield. Every day when Ed came home from school, his mother would wait for him with holy water from a spring, splashing it on his face to cleanse him of the sins he had accumulated throughout the day. She believed that upon entering the house, Ed needed to be purified and clean. He spent most of his free time in his room, reading secret books he brought home so his mother wouldn't confiscate them. Once, while he was playing with some friends in an empty lot, Augusta suddenly barged in to deliver a sermon, telling him that his friends would lead him to sin and that his life would become a living hell. This fanaticism and confinement lasted until 1940, when George, Ed's father, died of a heart attack at 66. Augusta was overjoyed, feeling liberated from the violent alcoholic. After George's death, Henry, the eldest son, helped with the farm work. In reality, Henry had found ways to escape his mother's control, maintaining friendships and even dating. Ed, on the other hand, was completely trapped on the farm with his parents, both physically and psychologically stunted. It's not an exaggeration to say that Ed Gein's life was destroyed by his mother. He was an adult, but remained emotionally immature, never having any romantic relationships with women. His mother was the only woman in his life. Disgustingly, Augusta began seducing her own son and sleeping with him. Henry was horrified to find his brother in bed with their mother. Arguments erupted, and Henry threatened to report everything to the authorities. But a few weeks later, on May 16, 1944, a fire broke out on the farm. In the middle of the night, the fields surrounding the family home, which they relied on for sustenance, were ablaze. The fire threatened the old building. Ed and Henry were awakened by the bright light of the flames and rushed outside to fill buckets with water to extinguish the fire. But then Henry disappeared. He was found dead after the fire on the field. The strange thing was that his body was found in the field where the fire broke out, yet there was not a single burn on his body. The police found bloodstains on his body, but due to the lack of a thorough investigation, the cause of Henry's death remained a mystery without explanation. So just 13 years after the case of Henry's disappearance, investigators discovered that his departure might not have been so natural after all, but rather to silence him. Now only Ed and his mother, Augusta, were living together. Not long after, Augusta suffered a stroke and passed away at the age of 67, unaware that her death would drive Ed even further into madness. Ed had lost the only woman in his life, his only friend, his lover, and his biological mother. Her body seemed to haunt Ed until she was buried on December 31st in a discreet funeral with only a few relatives present. Returning to the farm on December 31st, 1944, Ed found himself alone in the large house amidst the void. He wanted to ensure that his mother's faith would be respected for centuries to come. He placed twine and duct tape in the shape of a cross to ensure his mother's soul would forever rest peacefully in her room at home alone. Ed's life began to spiral downward, descending into madness. Alone on the farm with no one but his deceased parents and his brother's memory, he felt abandoned. Over 35 years had passed, and he had been trapped in the family's cocoon for too long, utterly clueless about what he would do next. He felt lost on the farm, always sensing someone watching him. He thought he was going mad. Ed began to see his mother's face everywhere, expecting her to speak to him or read the Bible to him as she did when he was a child. Later, he started reading things related to death, the occult, and occasionally came across stories of cannibalism, reading about the horrors of World War II that were still being broadcast and recorded through the media at the time. This was the only thing that interested him. Gradually, these things made him more fascinated with horrifying crimes that he later committed. Strangely, Ed seemed oblivious to his own atrocities. Normally, Ed did odd jobs to earn money. He was known as the village idiot, and people often called him fool. He looked at girls in a strange way when he worked in town. Later, he returned to his farm in the evening as usual, but it seemed people sympathized with his looks as they saw him as pitiful. In moments of crisis, he tried to summon his mother's spirit, but she never appeared. What led him to start grave robbing was when Ed Gein read the story of an aristocratic club that existed in the previous century. This club had formed a cult that dug up the graves of young girls in the local cemetery and then abused these unfortunate girls together. It was these stories that fueled Ed Gein's perverse desires. He told himself that it would be better to find young women who had just been buried, and that they would be like a pet horse on his farm. How to know which young women had just been buried? Simple. Just regularly read the obituaries of Plainfield and go to the cemetery at midnight. And he set about his work. He confessed that finally, I will also have a girlfriend and will no longer be lonely. He kept digging until he saw the coffin, then went down into the hole, opened the wooden box, and took her away. She was indeed a young woman, just like in the Plainfield obituary. Ed Gein hurriedly returned home, more excited than ever. From that moment, he isolated himself to live for another 10 years among the corpses. With his first victim, he performed some experiments, experiencing what he read on their bodies. At first, he abused his victims until their bodies began to decompose. So to preserve the bodies he considered his only friends, Ed Gein began to peel off their skin and then sun-dry it. He worked on different pieces of skin for hours and then created all kinds of objects that we know later. When the bodies were too decomposed, Ed Gein scattered them around the farm. After the first successful expedition to the cemetery, he did not stop. Later, he said he targeted 3 other cemeteries, mainly in the area around Plainfield. Indeed, his modus operandi was well established. It wasn't until 10 years later that the police discovered it, so it can be said that he was not as foolish as rumored. He continued to check obituaries, visit cemeteries, dig up graves, and bring bodies home. There were even times when he was quite busy, as he had to earn some money. Ed Gein kept all his beauties at home and wisely waited until the weekend, which he considered his little relaxation time. He would take the fresh bodies out of the large bag, place them on the living room sofa, and have some aperitif with them, talking about his week. These conversations never received a response. When winter came, he thought to himself that it was a bit chilly and having a second skin would be great. Instead of creating objects with the victims, he sewed himself a pair of pants from their skin. Later, he stated that his house was always heated with the fireplace on high so that the skin of the victims wouldn't get goosebumps. The worst part was that Ed Gein didn't even hide his creations. There was a small corner that children liked to play in, outside in the yard surrounding the farm, where they could see inside. Sometimes they would knock on his door, asking for a glass of water or a snack. Some children would leave Ed Gein's house in shock, telling their parents that they saw heads placed on furniture and that the house was haunted with people who didn't speak or move, placed on the sofa or hanging on hooks in the laundry room, exactly as the police later discovered. But no one believed the children. They thought the kids were just making things up. Ed Gein, the local fool, would never hurt a fly. Maybe he just didn't know how to maintain his house well. Imagine the faces of the parents when they finally discovered that their children had never lied, and when they saw the images inside Ed Gein's farm with their own eyes. They would probably have to move away. By now, you probably know who Ed Gein is. Why is he so famous in American history? He even had a hardened nipple belt that he made for himself and designed a human skull helmet. But above all, Ed Gein is famous because he wore a second hat, the hat of a serial killer. Back at the farm at the time of his discovery, the entire small town of Plainfield fell into a state of chaos and extreme terror before this pervert. Never before had the area seen so many people. About 100 journalists came from all over the states, and at that time, no one knew that most of the skin and objects found came from local graves, according to the list found on various websites. At Ed Gein's farm, they found a box of horns made of human skin, skulls placed on the table next to the bed, bowls and cutlery made of stretched human skin. But what particularly worried the investigators at the time was that Ed Gein lied when he stated that everything found in his farm came from the surrounding cemeteries with no victims he had killed. This was highly unreasonable because they found the genitals of young teenage girls dried and preserved in his house. Although in the following 10 years, no young girls or teenagers died in the area, some were reported missing. 8-year-old Georgia Weckler disappeared on her way home from school on May 1st, 1947. No screams, no blood, nothing. Only tire marks from a Max 4 that matched the car Ed Gein drove. In October 1953, 15-year-old Evelyn Hartley disappeared one evening while babysitting. After putting the child to bed, she vanished without a trace. Her shoes and glasses were found on the floor, with only the back door of the basement unlocked. Later, her blood was found on the door and even in the garden, and from that evening on, no one saw her again. What led investigators to believe he might be lying was that he did not admit to anything unless there was solid evidence. For example, the case of Mary Hogan, who disappeared on December 8, 1954, while working at a local bar, or the case of Bernice Worden, the woman who suddenly vanished while there were no customers in the tavern. Blood stains were found on the ground, along with empty shotgun shells and a trail of blood leading to the parking lot. At first, Ed Gein said he knew nothing until Mary's dried head was discovered at his house. He was not as foolish as people often said. Mental health experts examined his case and stated that Ed Gein had a completely normal IQ, even above average, at least 100. But he suffered from untreated schizophrenia for many years, sometimes accompanied by hallucinations. This was the reason why he often felt like his mother was talking to him. Notably, according to experts, he could hardly distinguish between good and evil. From the beginning, everything he did was his own doing. He only confessed to murder when there was evidence. Although the human remains found in Ed Gein's house did not come from cemeteries, including the complete skeleton of a young girl missing only her head, investigators could not identify her as Ed Gein refused to confess anything. When questioned, he always blamed others. He attacked Bernice Worden, the grocery store owner, because she looked like his mother and he wanted her in his house. He said that if he did these terrible things, it was all because no one ever cared about him. After 10 years of psychiatric treatment, in 1958, Ed Gein was finally declared fit to stand trial, and doctors now considered him mentally competent. The trial would take place without a jury, as requested by Ed Gein's lawyer, because anyone could declare him guilty before hearing the prosecution and defense's arguments and all the media coverage surrounding the case. Ed Gein was ultimately convicted and had to spend the rest of his life in an asylum. On July 26, 1984, at the age of 72, he died of respiratory failure. Ed Gein died and took with him the secrets of his true number of victims. The exact number of victims Ed Gein may have caused in 10 years has never been brought to light because he was one of the serial killers who did not officially confess to anything. What do you think about the story of this infamous killer in American history? Leave your comments below to discuss further together. Don't forget to subscribe our channel for more video. Thank you.